He didn't want to accept the role of Snape. He thought John Williams' soundtrack for the movie was terrible. He felt like banging David Yates' head against the wall and almost gave up playing the character. These are some of the notes that Alan Rickman made in his diary during his time there, while filming Harry Potter. What's up, wizards? How's it going? What big stars have to say doesn't always please the fans of a work, and there's an almost absolute truth. If you're a fan of someone, don't meet that person.
Unless you're mature enough to accept opinions that might be very different from your own. In other words, you have to know how to disagree with the person without letting it affect your view as a fan.
Alan Rickman brought to life countless iconic characters in the history of cinema, television, and theater. He had a career that spanned almost 40 years, and of course, he became very well known for his role in Harry Potter as Severus Snape. Unfortunately, Alan Rickman passed away in January 2016 due to pancreatic cancer.
But he left several records and diaries where he wrote about his career, about everything. And these diaries were published as a book, right?
They put these diaries together and released a book in 2022. Alan's diaries contained several opinions about Harry Potter, the behind the scenes of the movies, what he felt about the character, what he thought about some of his co-workers, and especially some of his frustrations. As a member of the team, to begin with, Alan didn't even want to take the role of Severus Snape. This role was initially offered to Tim Huth, who turned it down because he was going to film Planet of the Apes, which was around the same time. And so, Alan Rickman was called, right? So he wasn't the first choice, and then Alan didn't want to do it. There was already this idea in the media that he played villains, right? Because he was the villain in Die Hard. He played a few more in other things. People kept saying that, and since he didn't like it, he didn't want to do it. But then, David Heyman, who was the producer, went to talk to him, right? And on that occasion, David Heyman almost had a car accident. And then he even mentions this, right? Behind the scenes, and in behind the scenes content like that when he tried to convince Alan he almost had this accident, and that kind of made Alan go, okay, let's do it. The guy almost died here, so let's go. But obviously, he was joking, right? He didn't really almost die. So, when Alan Rickman agreed to play the character, he wrote the following in his diary. Feeling a certain emptiness about Harry Potter. What is really bothering me? He didn't feel anything. He didn't feel anything for the character, for the story, and that bothered him. This note is from the year 2000 while the movie was still in production, right? And then there's another statement, a letter that David Heyman wrote to him, where he said the following. Thank you for the success of Harry Potter. I know you feel frustrated, but you are also responsible for the success and so on. In other words, there was this frustration from Alan Rickman regarding the character Snape. And then, in another note, also from the year 2000, Alan reveals that he had a conversation with J.K. Rowling, and he says the following. She, nervously, let me in on some glimpses of Snape's past. Talking to her is like talking to someone who lives these and then...
não as inventa.
This occasion is very important because it's at this moment that J.K. Rowling says something very decisive for Alan Rickman to stay, to continue in the role, which is the importance of Snape, that he loved Lily. She only says this. She says this. Snape loved Lily, and that's important. And then, back in 2007, there's a note. Now we're going to jump ahead a lot, but later I'll go back to the notes from the recurring years. Here, after the 2000s.
But back in 2007, because we need to go there, because it makes a connection.
In 2007, after Deathly Hallows, after the book came out and Alan read the book, he wrote this down here. A small piece of information given by K. Rowling 7 years ago, Snape loved Lily. That gave me a cliff edge to hold on to. It was what kept me there on the edge of the cliff. You see? So, he finishes reading the book, and then he really understands, wow, everything that was there. You know, this statement he gives is exactly when he finishes reading Deathly Hallows. Then he mentions a small piece of information given by J.K. Rowling 7 years ago. That is, the book came out in 2007.
The movie Philosopher's Stone started being produced in 2000, so she gave him this information, and that's what he held onto for the character.
But don't think that was enough, because several times he thought about giving up. He filmed the scenes for Philosopher's Stone, did all his work there, and the movie was shown, right? There's always a party, a premiere, where the movie is shown to the whole crew, right? The cast. And then, man, Alan Rickman wrote this here about the movie. The movie should only be watched on a big screen. It gains a scale and depth that match John Williams' awful soundtrack. The party afterwards, at the Savoy, was much more fun. In other words, the party, the celebration afterwards, was more fun than the movie. Man, you see that, right? It's a really crazy thing. People have no idea what it's like because he was in the middle of it, you know? He was right there. It's not the same for us. We watch the final product. We fall in love with the story. We're fans. The person who's working on it, for them it's a job. You know, they might care about it. They might put some love into it, but it's still a job. That's why it's important for us to always understand that.
Now, my friend Alan Rickman, it's even unfair, right? Because Alan Rickman isn't alive. He can't say anything about these statements.
And I'm not even going to judge what he said. I'm just going to disagree. I disagree that John Williams' soundtrack is terrible in the first 2 Harry Potter movies. In the first 3, right? For me, those soundtracks are incredibly magical, iconic, and paved the way for all the soundtracks that came after. When John Williams left the project, right? Did John Williams only compose for the first 3 movies? Then came Nicholas Hooper, then Alexandre Desplat, right? So there are a lot of people who made incredible soundtracks there, right? Following the path that John Williams built and structured, and, come on, we're talking about John Williams, right? Did Alan Rickman think the soundtrack was terrible? I don't know, man. I don't know if he thought only the first one was terrible, or all of them, but yeah. And then, we move on to the recordings of Chamber of Secrets, and in 2002, the movie was released, and Alan Rickman said the following in his diary, talking to Paul Lyon Maris about leaving Harry Potter. No more Harry Potter. They don't want to listen, man. Paul, in this case, Paul Lyon Maris, was Alan Rickman's agent. He was determined to leave Harry Potter after Chamber of Secrets. Like, man, I don't wanna, like, he even adds, reiterating, no more Harry Potter. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear. It's the movie crew, the production team, like the people there. Man, go to sleep. Tomorrow is another day. That's what they were telling him. You know, they were telling Alan Rickman to sleep, that tomorrow is another day. But he didn't want to stay anymore. He didn't want to stay because that came a lot from his frustration about the character, you know, a lot of frustration. Alan felt that the character wasn't explored the way he should have been. You understand? But then there was this real risk of him leaving the franchise. But he was convinced to stay. He was convinced to stay. And then he stayed and filmed Prisoner of Azkaban. His contract wasn't for the whole thing. It wasn't an 8-year contract. He always renewed for each movie. We're talking about actors with a really high profile, right? Like Alan Rickman. It wasn't something like 8 years guaranteed. It was 1 year at a time. So, here's the thing. The Prisoner of Azkaban was released in 2004.
And here we have Alfonso Cuarón directing, who came in and really changed things up, completely changed the tone of the movie, right?
And Alan Rickman wrote the following in his diary. It's a really more mature movie, so full of boldness, that it made me smile the whole time. Every frame is the work of an artist and a storyteller.
In other words, Alan Rickman thought, just like all the Harry Potter fans, Prisoner of Azkaban.
It was a work of art, a masterpiece, right? By Cuarón. And he, Alan Rickman, really liked the third movie. It was his favorite, but there were also some conflicts. It doesn't mean everything was perfect, since he notes that he's under the usual Harry Potter pressure, and even starts rehearsing with the cameras before the actors. And these kids need to be, they don't know their lines. And Emma's diction is on this side of Albania. Sometimes he's referring to Cuarón, obviously, right? He's under the pressure of Harry Potter and all that. He needs to rehearse with the cameras beforehand because the kids don't memorize their lines. He's talking about the child cast there, right? Especially the ones with more lines, the trio. And then, he talks about Emma's diction. Man, he uses that expression, right? Emma's diction. Sometimes he's on this side of Albania, which he's saying means bad diction. Kind of bad. You know, sometimes it's hard to understand, and it seems like she's not even speaking British English there. That's why he says, oh, it's like she's on this side of Albania. It's an expression to say her diction was bad. So, you see, he's frustrated. We're talking about someone with years of experience versus kids in just their 3rd career year. It's honestly unfair, right?
It's even unfair, to expect the same level from an adult with years and years of experience as from a child.
But he says that, and there's even a comment he makes about Daniel where he says, "Oh, Daniel, he's hardworking and all, but I don't see him as an actor to keep working as an actor, a career as an actor. I see him directing, producing, but not as an actor." I don't know what he meant by that, But Daniel really found himself in theater. In fact, I watched a play with Daniel Radcliffe on Broadway, and it was really good. He's actually really good in theater. He even won the Tony Award for that play I watched, which is Merrily We Roll Along. It's really cool. He sings in the play.
I was surprised since I don't follow celebrities, so I had no idea he could sing. It was cool to watch, and then he talked about how difficult it is.
But he also had a few points there, with Cuarón himself, and he wrote the following. The day started fabulously, with the guillotine screen. He's being ironic, okay? The day started fabulously, with the screen guillotining my head.
In other words, his head was cut off in the framing, like here, my hat is cut off at the top. You see the tip of it? Look, this here. That bothered him.
A sudden and quick blackout, followed by the melancholy of an entire day. Alfonso quietly freaked out at me. I love him too much to let it last long, so I complained and sorted it out. That's it. In other words, he was bothered by this situation. Cuarón had a little freak out with him, kind of discreet, and he went there and complained, and they sorted it out, just like two adults working together. And that's it. And then, in 2005, my friends, 2005 saw the release of Goblet of Fire, right? November 2005. The movie started production back in 2004. Obviously, Goblet of Fire, boom, it was released, Goblet of Fire was done. He wanted to leave again, he wanted to quit again, and man, do you realize that this has a lot to do with the parts of Snape that were cut from the movies? Although Prisoner of Azkaban cuts out and hides a pretty important part of Snape, he was all frustrated and irritated there, but he was still happy with the movie. But in Goblet of Fire, they cut out Snape's importance, man, totally. Like, Goblet of Fire, There's Snape showing the mark, Dumbledore sending Snape there to do it. The mission he knew he had to do, which was obviously to go meet Voldemort, right? Because Voldemort had returned anyway, and then he stops, right? He gets stuck, like, man, I'm not going to go on. The fourth one was the last for me, and then, in 2005, there's a note in his diary that says, "Finally, I said yes to Harry Potter."
5. Order of the Phoenix. The feeling isn't really excitement or being depressed.
The argument that wins is the one that says, "See this project through to the end, it's your story." Those are his words, from Alan Rickman, that he wrote. So, he keeps playing Snape. Here, he says yes to Order of the Phoenix, man. Something like that. At that time, he was already fighting prostate cancer. He discovers prostate cancer, and he has surgery, and removes his entire prostate. And then, he says that, this was something that also made him want to keep going. Made him want to keep going.
So, during the filming of Order of the Phoenix, he was going through that.
And one thing that really bothered Alan was that the approaches from journalists, reporters, the media were unbearably targeted. To Harry Potter, nothing the other actors did seemed to matter. After all, Harry Potter was a phenomenon, right? So, if nowadays Harry Potter is still a phenomenon, just imagine back then, when it was at the peak with movies coming out, books coming out. Just imagine, the actors were only asked about Harry Potter all the time, and Alan Rickman got really fed up with that. So much so that he started to stop giving interviews. He started to stop giving interviews during that time. And then, Half-Blood Prince comes out. The movie Half-Blood Prince comes out. And then we have, Snape, with a big plot involving Snape in Dumbledore's murder. Him killing Dumbledore. So, it's a movie that should have been something like, it was supposed to be one of the most intense movies of the whole saga. And that didn't happen. The point is, if you think you're the only one bothered by the adaptation of Half-Blood Prince, Alan Rickman had this to say. "Now, I feel the need to bang the three Davids' heads together against the nearest wall. I understand the character development and the special effects. Amazing, stunning. But where's the story?" I mean, my friends, if Alan Rickman, who played Snape, wanted to bang those guys' heads against the wall, just imagine us, the fans of this thing. The three Davids he's referring to are David Yates, the director, David Heyman, the producer, and David Barron, also a producer. In other words, Alan Rickman. We're on your side. You never did anything wrong, and if you did, it was while trying to do good. Even now, I still feel like banging David Yates's head against the wall. And he asks, where is the real story? Where is the story of the Half-Blood Prince? In the movie, where is the story? We have several silly little moments of teenage romance, which is fine. It might even be in the book, but that's not the main point.
And the movie gets lost, in all of this.
Anyway, Alan Rickman was really frustrated with Half-Blood Prince, really frustrated. And then 2007 comes, right? 2007 arrives, and the last book comes out, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And then Alan Rickman writes the following in his diary. I finished reading the last book. Snape dies heroically. Potter describes him to his children as one of the bravest men he has ever known and gives his son the name Albus Severus. It was a true rite of passage. A little piece of information from J.K. Rowling 7 years ago. Snape loved Lily. That gave me something to hold on to, right? It gave him the edge of the abyss to hold on to. So, there. He was satisfied with the ending of Hallows in the book. In the book, he was satisfied. Now, about the movie, the note was as follows for Trafalgar Square. Remember that I showed in the video here about real filming locations, there in London, where I showed Trafalgar Square and mentioned that the premiere of the last movie was held there. That's right, Alan is referring to that about Trafalgar Square, which takes an hour. Once there, red carpets everywhere, a screen, a platform, an interviewer, and thousands screaming and singing Snape, Snape, Severus, Snape. The carpet winds its way to Leicester Square for the movie at 8 p.m. I found the movie unsettling to watch. They have to change the pace halfway through to tell Snape's story, and the camera loses focus. The audience, however, was very happy. Then he talks about Snape's death. A bit epic in Japanese. I found it disturbing to watch.
In other words, for him, Snape's death turned out to be something very dramatic, choreographed, and not something much more real. Like, how he felt it was in the book?
Anyway, not all of Alan Rickman's notes have come to light, right? They were made public in this book. There are more notes in this book. Of course, not all of them are about Harry Potter after all. He had a very extensive career, but these Harry Potter ones are really cool because we get to see a bit of the behind the scenes, right? And man, it's undeniable that Alan Rickman had a lot of affection for Snape. The proof of that was how bothered he was by the lack of exploration of the character. How it bothered him that they didn't tell the story behind things, In the movies, you can see he cared so much that he considered stopping completely.
If they're not doing it right now, my dear Alan Rickman, then, with all due respect to your memory and your legacy.
But to say that John Williams' soundtrack was horrendous, you got me there, my friend. Anyway, it's nice to check out the opinions of the man behind the character, even if we don't agree with all of them. Because, in the end, Harry Potter is about that. Harry Potter is about how we feel about the story, right? We are the fans, aren't we? It's something that, I see a lot of people, even nowadays, are still very attached to what the actors say about the movies. Oh, in fact, there were people. I've seen people saying they think the series is disrespectful to the actors, especially those who have already passed away, while we see that the actors were just working. It was their job. They wouldn't think like that. They don't see it that way. That doesn't exist, man. That doesn't exist, So, a lot of people always talk, right? When that Margoyle, the actress who plays Sprout, she's always joking around there, right? Talking? Harry Potter fans, grow up. It's been 25 years, and people still get really upset, right? They want to argue back, my friend. It doesn't really matter what the actress who plays Sprout is saying.
Or it could even be the actor who played Harry himself, or Dumbledore, whoever it is. What really matters is what you feel as a fan. You're a fan of the thing. That's what counts.
You don't have to base your fan experience on what someone else has to say. So I like to see their opinions, to see what they had to say. But that doesn't affect my love and admiration for the work they did at all, In fact, there's even a story about Alan Rickman. I don't remember exactly who told me. It was during these comings and goings at events, meeting people, a lot of Harry Potter fans. But I remember that someone once told me that Alan Rickman, he was kind of, not that friendly when he was approached on the street by fans. From what I was told, okay, I'm going to say this. I don't know if it's true, okay? I don't know if it really happened, but in fact, that's what I was told. That the person was in London, saw Alan Rickman, and asked to take a picture with him. And that he was kind of, not? He wasn't super friendly, but he wasn't rude either. And the person said that he said this.
No, you can't take a picture with me. You can take a picture of me, like from over there. You know, take a picture of me. Look, I took a picture of Alan Rickman. I don't know.
As I was saying, I don't know if this is true, but that's what I heard. Actors are people with their own lives, and not everyone has a good day. I'm really like that. I'm the kind of person who doesn't want to bother anyone.
I don't mind at events if people stop me, actually. Anyone who's met me at Comic-Con Experience or any event. You can come up to me anytime.
I'm really chill, but there are people who aren't, you know. And then there's this thing about feeling hesitant. I'm always hesitant. But that's how it is.
These were some of the notes about the production of Harry Potter through the eyes of Alan Rickman.
While he was in the movie, taking part in the film, being Severus Snape. In the movies, had you ever heard about these diaries? Had you seen what he had said? The book was published. You can buy it. It's not available in Portuguese, but you can try to find it somehow. It was published only in English.
But it's really cool. It's worth it. I'll see you in the next episode here on The Leaky Cauldron, and until then, mischief managed.